third message in the series. I do enjoy it, Keys to Personal Success. And today is really about courage, because I really believe that courage is so very, very important. In 15 minutes, Lisa, could you please come up here? Time your watch, 15 minutes. In the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 8, Daniel said this: I have determined that we would not defile ourselves with the king's food. It sounds easy just to read it. But when you're talking about a life-death situation, it moves me. In verse 17 and verse 18 of Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are about to be thrown into a fiery furnace and don't bow down to the king, said this: if the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. That made him real happy. But if he does not rescue us, we want you as the king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue set up. If the God we serve does not rescue us. That's one thing I found about the Christian walk. I don't always know how it ends up. I don't always know how the story ends. I read about the great men and women of faith in Hebrews. It says some of them were raised from the dead and some of them died. Some of them were victorious and others died. Each story is uniquely different. One person is incredibly healed, another person is not healed. One person sees a phenomenal financial miracle, another one goes through bankruptcy. It's an unusual story that I don't have all the answers to, but knowing this, God's not God because my prayer is answered. God is God, period. And if my prayer is answered, that's wonderful, but if my prayer is not answered, then he'll walk with me even in the fire. It was Andrew Jackson who said this: take time to deliberate, but when the time for action arrives, stop thinking and go in. Take time to deliberate, but when the time for action arrives, stop thinking and go in. I was reading again Ed Cole's book, Maximize Man. I've gone through that book 15, 20 times over the years. But I was thinking, have I sat down and just read the book without doing the work? Just read the book again. So I decided yesterday I'd reread the book. And it's great rereading the book again and just familiarizing myself again and again with the principles that I really believe and adhere to. And I was reading this book, it was reiterating courage. And in one of the chapters, in that book, it's called Tough and Tender. And how he was on a Christian television program, and it was a woman who was interviewing him. And she said, what's a message that you would give to my husband in regards to men's ministry? And he said, I would tell your husband, learn to be tough. And she reacted to that. She said, I don't want you to tell my husband to be tough. And he said, I didn't say rough. I said tough. And she couldn't separate the meaning of rough to tough. He says rough is abuse, but tough is being able to make the hard decisions, whether it's popular or not popular in the home, and making the hard decisions and being the priest in the home. Tough yet tender. No, honey, we're not going that direction. And I love you, and we'll go through this together. There's a story that I love immensely. It happened on July the 2nd in the year of 1863. It was a teacher by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a 34-year-old school teacher from Maine. He was a former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College. And on July the 2nd, in the year of 1863, he found himself in the fight for his life. He stood at the far left edge of a group of 80,000 men strung out in a line across fields and hills, stretching all the way to a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Sandra, Josiah, and I have been to that very place. Earlier in the day, his colonel, Vincent, had placed Chamberlain and the men of the 20th Maine at the top of the line saying this: whatever you do, you can't let the enemy through you. Whatever you do, hold the line. Joshua Chamberlain could not withdraw, and he knew it. If the Confederate army overran them, the rebels would barricade the higher ground, and the Union army would forfeit. In essence, 80,000 men would be caught from behind on a downhill charge with no protection if Joshua Chamberlain gave up this hill called Round Top in Gettysburg. To win, the rebels, the Confederate army, would have to come up this hill and literally go through Joshua Chamberlain's forces. He could not retreat. If he gave in, the Union army would be defeated. Now, successful people make their decisions quickly, and they change their minds slowly. Unsuccessful people make their decisions slowly and change their minds quickly. It was 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon. The first charge came. It came from the 15th and the 47th Alabama troops, running uphill as fast as they could, firing at Chamberlain's men stationed on Round Top Rock. It was a wall that had thrown up early that day. Chamberlain's men pushed the rebel army back. They charged a second time. They pushed them back. They charged a third time. They pushed them back. On the fourth charge of the rebel army, Chamberlain was hit by a bullet. It went straight to his belt buckle. He fell over onto the ground and got right back up and kept fighting. Again, the Confederate army troops rushed the hill. And at this point in history, battles were fought with artillery and ammunition. You would see your enemy's face as they surged up the hill. Chamberlain and his men had stacked up a rock wall of pie plate-sized rocks 110 yards long. On the fourth charge, the rebels almost breached the wall. And Chamberlain, while waiting for the next charge, thought, I'm just a professor of rhetoric. I'm fairly certain that I don't have anything anyone would care to learn from a professor at rhetoric at this point of my life. He said, I felt sorry for my men. He was not a professional soldier. He was recruited for the war. He said, my men didn't have a leader who had real knowledge of warfare and tactics. He said, the only thing I had going for me was that I was stubborn. And he says, and I suppose that's the greatest advantage I had in this fight. He said, I had deep within me an inability to do nothing. I could not do nothing. He said, I knew I may die, but I knew that I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am, at least like the Apostle Paul who wrote, the one thing I do is I press towards the mark. The attack came again. On the fifth charge, the men of the 15th and 47th Alabama group broke the wall open. They were fighting on both sides of the wall, and Chamberlain's men could not reload. They were almost out of ammunition anyhow, so they began swinging their guns at each other and hitting with their fists. Somehow, miraculously, Chamberlain and his men pushed the enemy back again. After pushing the Confederate army back 5 times, Joshua Chamberlain's brother Tom came rushing up with Sergeant Tozier, an old hard-nosed soldier who had this big wad of shirt stuck in a bullet hole in his shoulder. And he said, "Sir, we have no help from the 83rd. They've been shot to ribbons. There's nothing they can do. We're getting murdered on our flank. Can we extend?" Chamberlain asked. His brother Tom said, "There's nothing to extend. More than half our men are down." Now, Joshua Chamberlain's company had started in Maine 6 months earlier with 1,000 men at his command. They had started that morning with only 300 left alive, and now in the afternoon there was only 80 of them. He said, "How are we for ammunition?" "We've been shooting a lot," was the answer. Chamberlain said, "I know we've been shooting a lot, but I want to know how much ammunition we have left. What kind of ammunition do we have so I can assess this battle?" His brother went to check. And while his brother went to check, a 12-year-old lookout who climbed the tree yelled out, Colonel Chamberlain, the Confederates are forming up again. They're forming up right now. And what's worse, they're being reinforced. Sir, there's more of them now than there was before." He got news that his lead colonel, full colonel, Colonel Vincent, was dead. He got news about more who were dying left, right, and center. Surrounded, about to be pushed up the hill. His brother came running back, said, "Joshua, we're out. All we have is 1 round, maybe 2 rounds per soldier. But a lot of our men don't have any bullets." Chamberlain turned to a thin man standing at his right. It was his first sergeant, Ellis Spear. Chamberlain said, "Spear, tell the boys to take the ammunition from the wounded and the dead." Sergeant Spear replied, "We already did that last time." Chamberlain's men started wondering where they were going and what was going to happen. Because that's what men do. They look to leadership. Sergeant Spear said, "Maybe we should think about pulling out." Colonel Chamberlain retorted, "We'll not be pulling out. Just carry out my orders. We're staying put." Again, he heard his name, Joshua. It was his brother. "Here come the rebels. Here they come." And Chamberlain stepped on top of a wall in full view, crossing his arms and staring down at the advancing army. The 15th and the 47th Alabama, with their pale yellow-gray uniform, now reinforced by a Texas regiment, began moving up the hill. The high-pitched shriek of the Confederates, the rebel yell, moving up towards Chamberlain and his men. Sergeant Spear had returned and was standing at Chamberlain's feet. Sergeant Tozier, Chamberlain's brother, and another lieutenant were huddled below. And the brother said, "Colonel Chamberlain, give us the order what to do." Chamberlain just stood there, deep in thought, trying to assess the situation. He said to himself, "We can't retreat, but we can't stay here. When I'm faced with the choice of doing nothing or doing something, I always choose to act. It's the stubbornness in me." And he turned his back on the advancing rebels. And he looked at his men and he said, "Fix your bayonets." Can you imagine being given that command? At first, nobody moved. They just stared at him with their mouths open. He said, "We'll have the advantage of moving downhill. Fix the bayonets and execute a great right wheel of the entire regiment. Swing left first." Lieutenant spoke up first, confused. "Sir," he said, "what is the great right wheel?" But the colonel had already jumped off from the rocks and was moving to the next group of men. The old Sergeant Tozier answered this question. Lieutenant, when the colonel says the great right wheel, it just means charge. That's all it means, charge. And on the downhill charge, let the left swing around. Bayonets was the noise. Bayonets. Again, Joshua Chamberlain collected his thoughts. He said, I had deep within me an inability that I could do nothing. I knew I may die, but I knew I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am at least like the Apostle Paul who wrote, this one thing I do, I press towards the mark. The colonel pointed his sword directly downhill. He wheeled and faced his overwhelming odds. He slashed his blade through the air, and with a power born of courage and fear, the school teacher from Maine roared out, charge! Charge! Charge to his men. And the remaining 80 of 1,000 soldiers ran down the hill with their bayonets. Chamberlain was an incredible example of a leader who refused to give up or fail. He knew that we either move forward or we die. As they rolled over that wall, as they ran down the hill, every soldier, all 84, lifted their voice with their leader. Charge! 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 When the Confederate army saw Chamberlain, the leader of the opposition, mount the wall, they immediately stopped, unsure of what was happening with the noise. Charge, charge, charge. And when Chamberlain pointed the sword towards them and commanded his men to charge, they did something they hadn't done in the other 5 advances. They dropped their weapons and ran. The rebels were certain it was a different group of men. Surely, they thought, these men have massive reinforcements. No sane man would run without bullets or support. A beaten regiment would not charge. In less than 10 minutes, history records, Chamberlain had his sword on the collarbone of the captain of the Confederate army. He said, you, sir, are my prisoner. And the captain of the Confederate army turned a loaded pistol around and handed it to Chamberlain, who had not one bullet. He said, yes, sir, I am. That ragged group of 84 men under Chamberlain's command, without any ammunition, captured more than 400 soldiers of the enemy. Historians have determined that if Chamberlain had not charged that day, the South would have extended over that hill and come down and defeated the Union. Gettysburg is about 85 to 90 miles from Washington, D.C. In the American Civil War, 620,000 soldiers on both sides died. More than half of those who died of sickness and disease and of wounds from the battlefield. If you were to combine the American loss of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, it still doesn't equal the amount that was lost in the American Civil War with 620,000 soldiers. The beautiful thing about taking action is that each action you take changes things. Every time you do something, it matters. Be careful what you do. Every single thing we do matters forever. But most of us don't see this. Instead, it seems that some people are more important than others, and some of us are not needed at all, and some people believe they can do all things all by themselves. Fear no longer has a place in my life, as I have exposed fear as a vapor. Fear is an imposter who never had any power over me in the first place. So I do not fear failure, for in my life, failure is a myth. Failure only exists for the person who quits, and I choose not to quit. At this moment, you may be getting through one of the worst periods in your life. If that's the case, we call that normal. We are either in a crisis, coming out of a crisis, or headed for a crisis. We are either in a crisis, coming out of a crisis, or heading for a crisis. It's called being on this planet. Things may feel horribly wrong right now, but you are still here. And if you are still here, it means you haven't finished what you put here to do. The greatest part of your life, your purpose, is yet to be lived. There's more success to experience. There's more laughter to enjoy. And there is a protection that surrounds you, just like there was protection that surrounded Chamberlain when the bullet hit his belt. He got proof that until you accomplish what you put here to do, you will not and cannot be harmed. Joshua Chamberlain would later serve 4 terms as governor of Maine. That would be what we call premier. During the 3rd time of his service, he received the rather unusual letter. I'd like to read you a part of that letter. It arrived at the State House, addressed to Governor Joshua Chamberlain from a member of the 15th Alabama. The 15th Alabama meaning the Confederate Army, the ones who were against him. This is a letter that the member of the 15th Alabama sent to Governor Joshua Chamberlain in his 3rd term. Dear Sir, I want to tell you of a little passage in the Battle of Round Top, Gettysburg, concerning you and me, which I am now glad of. Twice in that battle, I had your life in my hands. I got a safe place between 2 rocks, and I drew bead fair and square. Bead means aim. Square and fair on you. You were standing in the open behind the center of your line, fully exposed. I knew your rank by your uniform in a sense. That's the pits on here. And I thought it a mighty good thing to put you out of the way. So I rested my gun on the rock and took steady aim. I started to pull the trigger, but some strange notion stopped me. So I got ashamed of my weakness, and I went through the motions again, and I took aim. I had you perfectly center. But that same strange something shut right down on me, and I couldn't pull the trigger, and I gave it up. That was your life, and I'm glad of it now, and I hope you are. When you have courage, I believe that there is a protection that surrounds you as you move and become what you want to be. You may never see it, but I can promise you this. There is no need to live the rest of your life or any part of your life in fear when you want to do God's perfect will. That's what I love about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's what I liked about Daniel. That even though they weren't totally certain of God's deliverance, they had this confidence that if God still had more for them to do as they were moving in God's will, He would protect them. And as Daniel stood defiantly on that 10 days, the king said he was more alert and astute. And as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, then if we burn, we burn. And they stood their place and they were cast into the fire. They saw a 4th person, our Lord. God's looking for men and women who are courageous in their walk and faith in God. He's looking for men and women who know what it is to move in the Spirit of the living God, not to move in an emotion or a feeling, to understand the difference between chronos and kairos. Kairos is a moment in time. Chronos is literal, that we don't try to force the time, but we understand there's a moment in time, and if we preempt it, doesn't mean God won't be there, but it might well be it'll be far harder. If we want to be people who learn what it is to succeed, as this series is about, then we need to be a people who have courage. What was Joshua Chamberlain's great success? Well, I don't think it was the battlefield, although I think that was a defining moment. I think it was 4 terms as governor of Maine, as a man who loved God and loved Jesus and wanted to govern his people and his state for the Lord. But I don't think he could have done it as well if he hadn't had a battlefield experience. When he realized that someone who was not a professional soldier but was a school teacher could be called up to do battle, he didn't go to the prime places of study and learning. He was just recruited. But all he knew he could do was be stubborn. Even his men didn't understand tactics. His lieutenant didn't understand the meaning of right wheel. It was the old sergeant who had to tell him it meant just charge. That's why I like the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros. I love those animal things. Do you? You know, I'm finishing off this way. It's like, what do you call a whole group of flamingos? You remember we call them? They're called flamboyant. Very good, Pastor Brad. Flamboyant. Flamboyant. Okay? Do you know that a flock of flamingos is called flamboyant? A group of crows is called a murder. Very good. Okay? A group of owls is called Parliament. Who? Your Parliament. I love this one. This is in every church. A group of vultures is called a committee. Is he dead yet? Do we eat him yet? Do we wait? Is it dead? Is it dead? Is it dead? It is. It's really, that's what it's called. It's called a committee. A group of tigers is called a ambush. Very good. You're very smart. An ambush. A group of tigers is called an ambush. A lion is called a pride. But I love the rhinoceros. Have you ever seen the rhinos? They could just kind of lean on the fence, kind of cross the leg like this, and they're just leaning back. They're these huge beasts. Do you know what you call a herd of rhinos, Susie? Do you know what it's called? What? A crash. No, I'm not making the stories up. You Google it. It's called a crash. Do you know I can really relate to them because they're short-sighted like I am. They're short-sighted. They can't see 30 feet in front of them, but they run at 35 miles an hour. You know what that means? They don't know what they're going to hit because they can't work it out because their eyesight's not that good. All they know, they're running at 35 miles an hour and they can't see 30 feet in front. So whatever that is, they're going to hit it. That's why they're called a crash. That's true. But they have this uncanny ability to have confidence in how they're made. Pastor Trevor used to call me Rhino Hide. That's why I like rhinoceros. Having a confidence in your call, having a confidence in what you're here for, having a confidence in your destiny, God. How many people have lost that or changed it?